Alright guys, welcome to RC Mojo. We've got a bit more to do on the TRX-4 facelift this week. We're going to finish trimming and get it painted. Just as a quick recap, last time we did the bulk of the trimming for the wheel clearances and had a quick play with some bumper positions. The rear bumper was almost a good fit, but the front bumper was just way too straight. It doesn't look right with the curved front of the body at all. So I did what most people would do in this situation and went off to eBay and bought a nice narrow bumper. I've got a feeling it's really meant for the Jeep bodies, but I think it's going to do the job. Along with the bumper we've got various mounts, shackles and a pair of LEDs. Not a bad pack of bits for a tenner or so. To mount the bumper to the TRX-4 we need to use the SCX-10 style rod mounts and a couple of the shorter screws. The screws just pop in at the front of the bumper so we can thread on the rods. The holes for the screws are actually slots so you can adjust the spacing, so for now we'll just leave them a little bit loose so we can find its position when we slot it into the chassis. With the body off we can slot the bumper and position the rods. They also have holes running through them for the screw pins that fit them to the mount. So to make sure the rods are at just the right angle, we can pop the screw pins in. They don't need to be screwed in, they just need to be sat in the holes to align everything. Now we can see how it sits under the body and we can adjust the position with a few light taps before nipping up the screws. We'll probably end up swapping these silver screws out for some black ones, but normally I'd recommend a bit of thread lock once you're happy with the position. At the moment then, the body is sat right up on top of the bumper, so we need to open up a space on the front of the body to fit around it. We could measure things and transfer dimensions, but this is a one-off, so we're going to use the classic draw around it method. It's going to take a few passes to get it spot on, but that should be okay. So with a Sharpie or other fine tip permanent marker we can trace around the top of the bumper. We've got quite a bit of material to remove so we can happily cut at least 6 or 8 millimeters without overdoing it. We also need to mark where the ends of the bumper come. There's a big gap between the ends of the bumper and the body right now, so we'll just mark them out roughly. To cut the strip out we need to score along the long dimension, not quite going to the end marks since we know they're not accurate. Then with some scissors cut up towards the score and snap the plastic out, which is easier said than done. The plastic around the front of the body is the best part of a millimetre thick. Even with a fairly deep score, a pair of pliers is really needed to snap it. Now if you ever look closely at your average ready-to-run body, you might have noticed how thin the plastic is around the front and the back. They tend to crack and tear very easily. One of the reasons the Proline bodies cost a bit more is usually the plastic is a lot thicker. I've got some Proline bodies from 20 odd years ago that are still perfectly serviceable. They don't always get it right, but usually they're worth the extra cash. Anyway, with the body back on we can push the bumper into the slot and see where the ends come with some degree of accuracy. We can now simply draw around the ends and cut the plastic out. So we've got some clearance all the way around the bumper now, but just to make things more difficult than they really need to be, I'm going to remove the bumper mount and flip it over. That's going to lift the bumper another 8 millimeters or so, which will help the approach angle a little bit, and I think the bumper will still sit under the grille, so it should look nice and tidy. This time with the cutout that we've already done, the body sits down on the body mounts nicely even with the bumper in place. So all we need to do is draw around the long edge, score and cut the strip out. And the bumper should more or less fit. And well, it's really close. It just needs a little bit of a tidy up with a Dremel using a sanding drum and I think we're going to be good to go. Okay, well we're nearly good to go. I want the bumper to be as close to level with the front of the body as it can be, but right now the nudge bar is coming into contact with the body on the grille surround. No biggie though, we just need to mark where the nudge bar is touching and cut a couple of notches. Now the body fits pretty much perfectly, the edges of the bumper are all within the body, perfect. There's a chance there might be a little more trimming to do later, but that's about as close as it's going to get for now. We can pop all the front bumper mount screws back in now. There's 4 that attach it to the chassis, and there's the 2 screw pins that set the bumper position. But because we flip the bumper over, they're going to get installed from the bottom rather than the top. And there's one thing for sure, that's a very solid bumper. It's going to be interesting to see how it handles major crashes when out and about. This TRX-4 has cartwheeled down some rather impressive heights, and the plastic bumper has always absorbed the impacts. This being metal and rather solid, it's more likely to bend out of shape and transmit all the force directly to the chassis. So we'll see how it goes. Before we start painting, we need to clean out the body. We need to make sure there's no oil or grease left in there at all. My stuff of choice is fairy washing up liquid with a soft nylon brush. Get in there with plenty of water and really get the froth going. Get into all the nooks and crannies. Then rinse all the soap out and leave the shell to dry out completely. From now on, when handling the shell, make sure your hands are super clean, which by now, with the current state of things, you should be well practiced at. And also, while you're at it, make sure your hands are completely dry. Any oils from your skin or water will get under the masks and promote paint creep, which nobody likes. The first masks to go on are the window masks, which are pre-cut. They just stick on the inside of the shell on the windows. There's some other bits that could do with masking too, like the wheel arches, and if you're planning to fit lights, masking the areas behind where the decals go isn't a bad idea too. For the bulk of the masking, I'd highly recommend Tamiya masking tape. It's really not the cheapest by any stretch, but it's consistently rather good, as you'd expect from Tamiya. Cheap tape from the hardware store can always be a bit hit or miss. After an hour or so of applying the tape, we have a rather yellow body. Since the body is going to end up a bright colour, I've left a gap around the window masks on the cab and modified the windscreen masks so we have a bit of a border around them. It's worth noting at this stage I was still in a bit of a hurry to make sure the truck was up to scratch for the Southern Scale Trail event at the end of the month, but not too surprisingly it's since been cancelled. In my rush, I forgot to mask around the grille area. I also didn't spend as much time on the curved mask edges as I'd liked, so they're a little bit polygonal. It's still going to look fine as long as it's not inspected with a magnifying glass though. Anyway, after a lot of very light coats of black paint, we look like this. When painting, the first few coats are the most important. As long as you keep it light and leave it 10 minutes or so between, you'll avoid paint creep. If you go in and really lay on the first coat of paint, it's going to find any iffy edges on the masking and get sucked right under the tape. Always use light coats and lots of them. Now we can peel off the Tamiya tape, remembering we're going to be touching the inside of the shell, so wash and dry your hands again. Now we can see the borders around the windows clearly. That's really going to make the windows pop once the main colour goes on. It should really have been around now that I notice I've missed the grille, but hey ho. Next we have the main colour, again lots of thin coats. Now I ended up using a whole can of Core RC paint to achieve this rather fetching shade of green. I think it should stand out quite nicely. Unfortunately, but not too surprisingly, with a lighter colour it's still easy to see through. It would probably be okay as is, but to make it a bit more solid we'll back it with some white paint. The difference in this light is fairly subtle, but when outside, especially when the sun's behind it, it's going to look like a solid body. Next up, because I'm not planning on running an interior, the idea is to reduce the weight after all, I'm going to use window tint paint. The window masks peel off first, and then we just layer up the tint. The technique is a little bit different with this stuff though. If you use light coats it's going to end up looking a bit spotty. You can get around this by keeping the first couple of coats nice and thin to evenly prime the surface. Then on the third coat use a thicker coat so the paint has time to level out before it dries. You just have to be very careful not to overdo it and let the paint run. When done it should look like this. The window tints look a little bit dark in this light, but outside they look about right. Next up, the wheel arches and the bonnet vent. Right now, because the paint's on the inside, they're going to look incredibly glossy once the overspray film comes off, which isn't good. So we need to peel back just a little bit of the film to uncover the arches and mask them off. We don't need to peel all the film off, as it'll be quite happy keeping the paint off the rest of the body. It should end up looking something like this. Just as before, don't be tempted to rush, keep the coats light and even. Once dry, we can start the final peel. Some of you might be wondering why I painted the inside of the arches black when we're going to paint them on the outside anyway. Well, if we'd painted the inside neon green, when the black paint on the outside gets scratched, it won't just look rough, the green paint will show through the black. Not ideal. That's the painting done then, so next we need to sort out the rear bumper. If we fit the stock bumper with its mount upside down, it's really close to fitting. The back of the body is sat up on the ledge of the bumper, so if we could move the bumper in a few millimeters and lower it just a little bit, it would be perfect. This sounds like a job for the 3D printer. So here we have a new mount that sets the height of the bumper, and more importantly, sits almost flush with the back of the chassis, so we can tuck the ledge of the bumper right under the body. Now I'm not going to bother putting this part up on Thingiverse as it's very much specific to this build. A slightly different body position would need a different mount. It does show why 3D printers are so useful though. Making a new mount without one would have been a real pain. Next we can refit the wheels and tyres, and by now we all know how to do that. It's just an M4 nut after all. So we'll just cut to the truck up on its wheels. And yep, that's pretty close to how I had it looking in my head. The rear end is a little bit open, if you know what I mean, but that lifted bumper is going to really help the departure angle so much over the stock Defender setup. So, decals next, and in the past I've tried to show most of the decaling process, but just like using a sharp knife for cutting the body, it's not the easiest thing to do when there's a large camera directly in front of my face. So I'm going to go through fitting one decal and do the rest off camera. A good little example is the handle for the tailgate. Now, as always, there's a number of methods for dealing with decals. This is just how I usually do it. First then, I roughly cut out the decal, so it's a bit easier to handle. Next, I carefully cut the decal out, cutting away all the clear surround. It's worth noting I do this with pre-cut decals too. It's a lot easier to gauge the position when it's not trying to stick to everything that it gets in close contact with. When you're sure it's going to fit nicely, peel back the backing just a little bit and trim some from the edge. We want the bulk of the decal still to be protected and have just a thin strip with the sticky exposed. Now we can position the decal so it's absolutely spot on, then stick down the exposed sticky, peel off the backing and smooth down the decal. The rest use the same procedure, so just rinse and repeat. Now, before we have a proper look, there's one more thing to do. The sills on the side of the shell are just a little bit too high to sit in the slots on the rock sliders, so we need to lift them by around 6mm. And that sounds like another job for the 3D printer, so I've made some inserts that are going to space them off. All we need to do is remove the 4 screws that attach the sliders to the side of the chassis. Drop in the spacer and reinstall using some longer screws. 14 or 15mm long M3 screws should be about right. The holes the screws thread into are quite deep, so it's not super critical. As long as there's 5mm or so threaded in, they're going to do the job. Now when we pop the body back on, the bottom edge sits in the slot. So now when the body rubs on the terrain, it's not going to flex. Plus, we've gained a good 6mm of ground clearance, which really can't hurt. The other side is exactly the same, except this time I'm also going to remove the power button lever. It was very useful with the Defender body, as you can't really get to the button when the body's on. With this setup though, it's still going to be accessible, so the lever's just going to get in the way. Well, I thought that was the last thing, but the front bumper came with some shackles, so we should probably fit them too. They just offer up to the bumper and a threaded pin threads in to attach them. Simple enough. And there we go, one very bright TRX-4. Other than the green grille surround, I think it's come out rather well. And to be honest, the grille surround being green doesn't look too out of place. I think I can live with that. Outside of the normal videos, we've also live streamed rebuilding the axles using new bearings to replace the worn ones and replacing the grease. Hopefully we'll stream the gearbox strip down soon. It's still feeling a little bit stiff, so I'm fairly sure some water's got in there and at the very least washed away the grease. In the next video we'll be swapping the radio gear for FlySky, or if the metal bits for the WPL C44KM turn out, we might get that chassis on its wheels. The parts left Heathrow today as I'm recording the voiceover, so that would be good to get back to. And that's going to be it for this week then. So, as always, thanks for watching. Like if you liked, subscribe if you haven't, and leave a message if there's something on your mind. Bye guys!